It's March 2023, and it's 20 years since the US invasion of Iraq of 2003. A lot has happened since then, but the mainstream media hasn't really covered much of what's been going on in Iraq in recent years. So today we're going to discuss how we got to this point, how we got from Iraq prior to the US invasion, prior to the insane level of sanctions imposed on the country in the lead up to the invasion, how we got from Iraq, led by the Arab Socialist Party and Saddam Hussein, as being the most prosperous country in the Middle East and the Arab world, with the socialist system, with healthcare, education provided by the government, with massive development of the country, massive industrialization of the country, electrification of the country, bringing water to the people, something that is often overlooked. These basic things sort of overlooked, but prior to the Ba'ath Party coming to power, these things weren't the case. But under the leadership of the Arab Socialist Party, they were able to develop the country to become such a prosperous country. And that's one of the reasons why the United States wanted to destroy the country. And we got to the point where we are with the U.S. and where we were with the U.S. invasion and all of the destruction that's gone on till that point, till today. So today we're with a returning guest, Falastini Moghtareb, who you probably saw on the channel on Flame of Liberation back in October when we discussed the ongoing protests in Iraq, which were going on at the time and are still going on. So yeah, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Nick. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and I thank you and the Flame of Liberation for giving me the opportunity to speak about Iraq. As I mentioned off the air, I don't get the opportunity to speak to leftists or activists, for that matter, in the United States in particular. Last time when we met in October, I think you told me we had about 1,000 people watch our video, and to have the opportunity to speak to 1,000 people is welcome, given that the imperialist media, day in, day out, 24 hours a day, pumps false information against Iraq, and has millions and millions of people that listen to it all over the world. So as many people as we can get the message across to, with the real facts of what took place in this criminal war that was launched 20 years ago about a country, or against a country that was thriving by all measures. I remember attending a talk at the University of Texas in Austin during the time of the sanctions, and I clearly remember the speakers talking about how Iraq's infant mortality rates reflect a healthcare system that was superior and similar to that existed in Europe. So Iraq, indeed, under the Ba'ath Party, was a model Arab state, and that was one of the reasons why the imperialists wanted to target Iraq, as we will speak in today's broadcast, because it was so successful. if it wasn't successful, if it wasn't truly anti-imperialist, then why would the US go out of its way to commit 500,000 soldiers? There were 500,000 US soldiers that were deployed to topple Saddam Hussein and to destroy the rule of the Ba'ath in Iraq. And despite that, there was heroism on the part of the Iraqi people fighting back, as we will talk. So thanks for giving me this opportunity, and I'm very happy to be here.
Absolutely, and thank you for joining again. And no, as you said, Iraq was extremely developed and extremely prosperous at the time. And unless people understand how things were prior, they really can't understand just how egregious the invasion and destruction of the country was. And for more information on that, I think people should check out, I did a video a number of years back, and most people have probably seen it already, but my video on Baathism really goes into depth on the massive development of Iraq that was going on prior to the US invasion. So people should check that out for more background information on the development of Iraq and socialist system in the country. So prior to the US invasion of 2003, the US was really declaring war against Iraq, but even before the US invasion. There was, people know about the first war that the US had with Iraq in Kuwait, but also a little bit before then, and obviously after then especially, through the 90s, the US was imposing extreme sanctions against the country based on lies to basically weaken the country, try and destroy the country, because they wanted to weaken this vanguard Arab state, socialist state, and to really demonstrate the US unipolar order, which had just come about with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in the 90s, the US was basically running amok internationally, and Iraq was one of the examples where the US policy was just causing so much destruction. And so can you talk a little bit about that before the US invasion, the sanctions based on lies that were going on that the US imposed against the country?
Sure, Nick. Now, it even predates before the sanctions. We'll talk about the sanctions, but the conspiracies against Iraq began almost immediate to when the Ba'ath took power in 1968. Back in 1968, there was a revolt, and the Ba'aths led that revolt that took power in Iraq. In 1968, from 1968 to 1970, there was a CIA-run operation called the Gazelle operation, and this involved recruiting some traitors, Iraqi traitors, to overthrow the Ba'athist rule. So right at the outset, you knew that the imperialists were not going to let a socialist party rule in Iraq and thrive. So it was almost immediate to when the Baathists took power that the CIA began to operate covert operations, and this involved smuggling stashes of, caches of arms to these traders that were later caught by the Baathists, and they were dealt with. I think they were executed. And to make the imperialists even more aggressive, in 1972, one of the first things the Baathists did was nationalize the oil, so that oil could no longer go to the United States, run corporations, and instead would benefit the people of Iraq and would help in building Iraq into the thriving state that it became with the money, with the revenues generated by the oil industry. In 1973, the Baathists, having nationalized their oil, joined the 1973 October offensive against Israel and deployed their tanks and aircrafts and soldiers that fought heroically alongside Syria and Egypt. And the imperialists in both Britain and the United States looked at that with a lot of worry. because here was a vanguard revolutionary party that took power in a vital area of the Arab Gulf and was, nationalizing its oil, was building socialism, attacked Israel, was fighting alongside Syria and Egypt, and sought unity, Arab unification of the countries. Speeding through, the Ba'ath Party never enjoyed a moment of peace. In 1979, when President Bakr retired from ruling Iraq, President Saddam Hussein took power, and not a year had passed until Khomeini attacked Iraq in 1980. Not only that, but Israel deployed its aircrafts and destroyed the nuclear plants that were being built by the Iraqi army. If Iraq had succeeded in getting nuclear missiles, or its nuclear program was protected at that time, they would have been in a much better position to fight the imperialists. But here was Khomeini launching his offensive, trying to export his revolution into Iraq, inciting the Shia population of Iraq against the Ba'athist government. There was an attempt at the life of the Prime Minister Tariq Aziz at al-Mustansariya, where an Iranian agent threw a hand grenade that missed Tariq Aziz and killed a few nearby civilians that were there. So, if you think about it, 1968, this attempted coup, back in 1980, the launch of the Iranian war against Iraq, which, by the way, Iraq came out victorious in, stopped the offensive of the Iranians, whose aim was to topple the Ba'athist government and to take over Iraq and annex it to Iran. So from 1980 to 1988, President Saddam heroically, with the Iraqi army, defended the Arab region as a whole against Khomeini's expansionist plans. And this didn't end until 1988. Now, having fought for 8 bloody years with much sacrifice and the number of Iraqi soldiers that were martyred during that war, the Kuwaitis began, alongside Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to lower the price of oil. And so Iraq, now coming out of this war, needing revenues, oil revenues, to reconstruct the country after the devastating 8 years, we're now facing an economic attack by these reactionary regimes that were allied with the United States, and were aiming now to weaken Iraq because they saw in Iraq emerging from the Iranian war as a threat to their own rule. And so they had to sabotage that successful experience built by the Ba'athists in Iraq. And so things escalated very fast. In 1990, before the invasion of Kuwait, the Americans and the British, and I have a quote here from an interview, declared that Saddam was a threat to the interests of the Americans. And so they weren't just talking about this, they actually began running military maneuvers in the Arabian Gulf. We call it the Arabian Gulf, they call it in the US Persian Gulf. And so these military operations were launched July 1990. Can you imagine? In 1 month before Saddam Hussein did his preemptive invasion of Kuwait. So Saddam and the Ba'athists knew that they were being targeted by the imperialists, and that these military maneuvers, get this, these military maneuvers were being run by the US Navy on an imaginary enemy, and that imaginary enemy was Iraq. So they were in fact preparing to topple the Ba'athist government with the help of the Kuwaitis, with the help of the Saudis, with the help of the Arab Gulf states, before Saddam even went into Kuwait.
That is very reminiscent of what the US tried to do with Cuba, actually, because before the Bay of Pigs invasion, CIA proxy invasion of Cuba, the US was doing military drills on like some other island, and on some quote unquote imaginary fictional enemy, basically trying to like prepare for an invasion of Cuba. That's sounds almost exactly like what the US is doing in this case with Iraq. But sorry, please continue.
Yeah, good point, Nick. And so it's exactly the same strategy. So for those out there that believe the lies of the American media and the Western media at large, if the reason for attacking Iraq was the invasion of Kuwait, what the hell was the U.S. military doing in the so-called Persian Gulf in July of 1990? That's 1 month before Saddam Hussein even set foot into Kuwait. But the Baathists knew this. They knew from back when they dealt with the CIA back in 1968 through the Iraq-Iran war. They knew that the United States would not leave the Baathists alone in Iraq, that it was just a matter of time before they invaded Iraq and before they tried to topple the rule of the Ba'ath in Iraq. So in fact, in 1990, in July, there were rapid deployment of troops, maneuvers being carried out, exercises in the so-called Persian Gulf by the United States Army. And so it was a matter of time before the United States was going to invade Iraq. So was this a reason for President Saddam Hussein preemptively going into Kuwait, knowing that they were coming anyway? Yes, I think that, looking at the facts now in retrospect, I think part of his calculations at the time was they're going to come after us anyway. We might as well just go in. And he did. And they went in there and they stayed for a while. It was, I think, about 6 months before the first Gulf War took place. The first Gulf War, in fact, took place in January of 1991. And for the audience, you need to know the chronology of events. You see, this is all in the context of the end of the Cold War. So in 1991, December of 1991, the Soviet Union came to an end, sadly. And before that, in 1989, that traitor Gorbachev struck a deal with the United States to end the Soviet Union. And so the whole world map was about to be rearranged. And the imperialists, they knew this. They knew they were going to settle scores now because they had the upper hand over the Soviet Union. Before that, they had to negotiate with the Soviet Union. But now with the Soviet Union gone, there was no one to stop their plans. And so they immediately put it in effect. And one of their plans was to get rid of the Ba'ath in Iraq because they wanted to end anything that was anti-imperialist in the region. There was nobody to back Iraq. The Soviet Union wasn't going to back Iraq anymore. So it was clear sailing for them to go in and destroy Iraq. And now we know, in retrospect, that they went after Libya shortly after, and now Syria and so on. And so they were rearranging the map of the region to suit their interests and to suit the interests of Israel, their close ally. And so the end of the Soviet Union took place in December 1991, and President Saddam went into Kuwait on the 2nd of August 1990. And during that time, the Baathists knew that there was going to be a reconfiguration of the balance of power in the world because they knew that the Soviet Union was collapsing. And they knew that the US was running maneuvers in the Arabian Gulf. And so, right or wrong, the way they saw it, they went into Kuwait. And they ended that reactionary regime's rule for 6 months or so, up until the point where the United States launched a 30-country attack on Iraq. It's like they brought the whole world to fight Saddam's army in Kuwait, and eventually were successful in driving them out. Now, what took place afterwards was what you rightly described as a barbaric, 10 years or so of sanctions. And these economic sanctions were literally killing babies in Iraqi hospitals. And we have much documented evidence of the inhuman sanctions that were imposed on Iraq, where, they couldn't import, you know, grains, food, medicines, equipment to fix hospitals, to fix buildings, to fix um, road construction, everything that was affected during the first Gulf War. As you know, this was also devastating given the shelling of Iraq through air bombardments. There was a no-fly zone where Iraqi airplanes could not protect the troops that were on the ground. They would be shot down. And all of this with the collusion and conspiracies of the Arab reactionary regimes. If it weren't for their role, it wouldn't have been easy to encircle Iraq and suffocate its successful Ba'athist government. And so, in short, these were the events that eventually led to the invasion of Iraq. After 10 years had failed to conspire against the rule of the Ba'ath, they couldn't topple President Saddam. President Saddam still had a strong upper hand on what happened inside of Iraq. They tried to incite the Shiites, or some Shiites that were sympathetic to the Iranians, to topple the government, but it was quite quickly crushed. The Iraqi army went in there, and I remember seeing video footages of this where officers of the Ba'ath would go in and arrest those that were planning, I should say, to overthrow the government. And so they failed. They couldn't get the Iraqis as they thought. They thought the Iraqis would just wait for the opportunity as economic situation was deteriorating, that they would just all rise and they wouldn't have to go in there and topple Saddam Hussein, that the Iraqis themselves would topple Saddam Hussein. But the Ba'ath came out victorious in the sanctions war. It maintained power. And when the US invasion took place, there were 1 million Iraqis under arms. I don't know how many countries in the world can claim 1 million soldiers, but if you go to Wikipedia, which is a pro-imperialist, the information I got in preparing for this interview came from just reading on Wikipedia. And I was amazed because what I was reading wasn't exactly what I knew from Iraqis that I've spoken to. It was tilted towards the American tale. But even by the American standards, there were 500,000 Iraqi soldiers that fought in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and there were 650,000 reserve. And so we're talking about over 1 million Iraqi soldiers under arms that the Ba'ath had prepared for the invasion. By contrast, and according to Wikipedia, there were 500,000 US soldiers that were involved in the invasion of Iraq. So you had 500,000 on the American side, and you had 1 million Iraqis on the Iraqi side. And so that was the buildup that led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, you did ask about the lies that were fabricated. And so there were many lies to justify the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Let me give you 3 of them. Number 1, there was that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, which was quickly, dismissed by experts in the United Nations and the inspection teams that went into Iraq and proved that that was a lie. And even as recent as the few years that has passed, Tony Blair has been exposed as a big-time liar in supporting the US fabrication that President Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Let me give you some quotations that I pulled out from reading about what took place. Richard Pearl, who was advisor to George W. Bush, said that when he was asked in an interview, he said, our reasons for invading Iraq are basically to rid Iraq or Saddam Hussein of weapons of mass destruction and to topple the rule of Saddam Hussein. Just as simple as that. It was the same decision that the Americans and the British had taken in 1989, even before the invasion of Kuwait, when they said blatantly that Saddam Hussein was a threat to their interests and that he had to be removed. And so we have evidence of this. It's not like they were shy about it or they tried to hide it. Another fabrication took place after the Twin Tower attacks in September 11th of 2001. At that time, the Bush advisors, along with George W. Bush, is not a very smart man. He's in fact known to be, quite dumb in his thinking, and he's not even articulate or anything like that. But what's the name of that American director? He did a really good film about George W. Bush. I can't remember his name.
Michael Moore, maybe?
Michael Moore, yeah, thank you, Michael Moore. If you think that's just me speaking, watch Michael Moore's depiction of George W. Bush and his competencies of running the country.
Oh yeah, I think most Americans are. Unfortunately, now there's some work by some neocons and the mainstream media to try and whitewash and rehabilitate Bush, but I think they're going to be unsuccessful. I think honestly, most Americans at this point know what a complete, not only criminal but just idiot George Bush was. But yeah, please continue.
It's not very smart. And the other day he confused Ukraine with Fallujah. So
yeah,
and he's not even he's not running the country anymore. So he's not that under that much pressure. But it's just that the guy. I'm not sure. Don't quote. I think he was either smoking pot during college and I think his daughters were even caught smoking pot after him too. But that's the kind of background George Bush is or has. And in any case, George Bush decided in 2011 2001 after the Twin Tower attacks, that there was a link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. Now that's laughable for anybody living outside the US. Because
absolutely.
if you know anything about the Ba'ath, you know that they're definitely anti-Al-Qaeda. And in fact, if Al-Qaeda fell under the hands of the Ba'ath, they would execute them.
100%. And if I could add one thing to that, bin Laden was actually in direct conflict with Saddam Hussein, actually, because okay, just a little background. I'm sure most people already know this anyway, but in the 80s, the US was funding Al-Qaeda to fight against the Soviet Union and the Afghan socialist government, and the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. And bin Laden was there in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the main stronghold at the time was over the border in Pakistan, where they were training them and funding them and sending them in across the border. But so as the Soviet Union was pulling out of Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda was getting the upper hand in Afghanistan, that was the same time when the first Gulf War, the war in Kuwait, was happening, and bin Laden actually sent his quote-unquote mujahideen forces to Saudi Arabia, because again, he was a Saudi, sent his Al-Qaeda forces to Saudi Arabia to offering to protect Saudi Arabia against Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army. So they were directly in opposition to each other. Here you can see that the so-called Afghan Mujahideen were part of the U.S. coalition against Iraq and the Gulf War. According to the U.S. Army College Strategic Studies Institute special report on the Gulf War published on March 25th, 1991, 300 Mujahideen fighters from Afghanistan joined U.S.-led coalition forces as of February 11th of that year. So to be absolutely clear, these fundamentalist extremist forces that would later be known as Al-Qaeda joined the fight against Saddam Hussein on the side of the US. Al-Qaeda was against, bin Laden was against Iraq and in the war with Kuwait. So it was, and then as you mentioned, the ideology as well. The Ba'ath Party has nothing to do with this sort of Salafist, jihadist, extremist ideology that Al-Qaeda was promoting. It's completely at odds on so many levels. But yeah, please continue.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And okay, so George W. Bush isn't that bright, but I mean, he has around him some pretty intelligent counselors, councils. But even though those idiots tried to sell to the American mainstream public opinion that there was a link between Al Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. Now, mind you, you've got to understand that you live in New York, Nick, so you know this. You know, when the Twin Towers were hit, there was a mass backlash of revenge-seeking, right-wing. You know, I was in the U.S. at the time. I remember standing guard at our local mosque because we were afraid that, you know, these right-wingers would come and shoot up the mosque. And in fact, we have one incident, and this was back in Dallas, Texas, where I lived, and that we had a local mosque. You know, some guy drove at night and shot up the mosque with bullets. You know. It was that kind of environment. So it wasn't difficult for the Bush administration to sell the idea of revenge. You know, let's go out and take revenge for the attacks on our country and on our sovereignty, and let's just, you know, blast Afghanistan and Iraq into oblivion. You know, there were people, you've got to understand, you know, imperialism lives off of ignorance, and there's mass ignorance. That's why we're doing this show. There's mass ignorance in American mainstream, you know, the people, everyday people. They don't know where Iraq is. They don't know what Iraq looks like. They've never been, most of them have never been outside the United States. They're not exactly internationalists. They haven't read Marx. That, you know, the environment in the United States is very easily manipulated against Arabs, against Muslims, you know, and let's just send out our troops and blow the hell out of it.
And another thing is the education system in the US is so bad. So that's another thing. People are just not educated, and that's deliberately so, you know, the capitalist education system. So that also helps them spread their propaganda.
You know, when I first immigrated to the US, I was 17 years old, and I was in Colorado, and people in Colorado didn't know where Palestine was. I would have to pull out a map and actually point out where Palestine, even though many of them were Christians and went to church and knew about Bethlehem, but they never actually understood where geographically where the country lies, and that the people there were in fact Arabs, and, you know, people that looked like me, and that was my country, my ancestral home. And it's just that level of ignorance. They've never seen. They would confuse an Iraqi with an Iranian. They wouldn't know the difference between the two. You know, they were coming out of the Iranian hostages at that time. And so they would think everybody Arab was Iranian or Sikh or Indian. They can't tell the difference. In fact, they still couldn't tell the difference in 2001. In 2001, many Sikhs were attacked or either shot at because they were thought to be Arabs. And they would come out on, I remember listening to them on the radio saying, "We're not Muslims, don't attack us. Don't come after our, you know, stores. We have nothing to do with Muslims, and we're not even Arabs." You know, but it's that level of ignorance that you're dealing with. That's why you need shows like this to get to as many Americans as possible. So let's just settle the score, okay? Saddam Hussein has nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, did not possess weapons of mass destruction. These were both fabrications and lies that everybody now knows.
Yeah, that's a very good overview of the lead up to the invasion of Iraq and everything that was going on. And that was very well put, how you said, you know, when the Ba'ath Party came to power in 1968 up until 2003, you're right, it was actually a consistent attack by the imperialists from the late 60s, because 68, late 60s through the 70s, there were constant CIA attempts to overthrow the socialist government because, again, Ba'athist socialist Iraq nationalized the oil and other industries, and the imperialists were very much against that and declared its support for the anti-imperialist forces around the world, declared its support for the socialist bloc. It was the first technically non-Marxist Leninist state to recognize East Germany, actually, which is, I think that's very significant because it shows you that this is a country that's very much supportive of the socialist bloc, which Iraq is part of at the time. And so the U.S. imperialists were very much threatened by this. And as you said, once the Soviet Union collapsed, the imperialists took that as an opportunity to go after Iraq. And there's a reason why Iraq was the first country they went after. I think it says a lot that Iraq was the first country that they went after right as the Soviet Union was collapsing. In fact, they didn't wait long at all. I think the fact that they went after Iraq and not some other country tells you how revolutionary, how anti-imperialist Iraq was. But yeah, you mentioned also the Iran-Iraq War, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions about that and the U.S. role in that. The U.S. was actively backing Iran, giving weapons to Iran, and Israel was actively backing Iran, did an airstrike, as you mentioned, on Iraq's nuclear facility, which the Iranians had previously attacked. The Israelis went in and basically finished the job of what the Iranians were trying to do in that nuclear facility in Al-Sarek. So yeah, from the coups, attempted coups, complete failures by the CIA and the imperialist powers against the Ba'ath Party in the 70s, to the Iran-Iraq War, which Iran was backed by U.S. imperialism and by Israel, that had completely failed to overthrow the socialist government in Iraq, the government of Saddam Hussein, and prior to Saddam, Bakr. It was completely unsuccessful then, as you outlined, with the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in Kuwait, and all the sanctions in the 90s. It caused a lot of devastation and death and killed many Iraqis. Madeleine Albright was famously interviewed and admitted and said that it was worth it. She said, "We think it was worth it." Shows you the mindset that 500,000 Iraqi children had died as a result of sanctions. And she agreed with that statistic, and she was saying that it was worth it.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
So that all of this was a failure to overthrow the government of Iraq. So they eventually had to, to try and overthrow the government, they went for a full-on invasion in 2003. And so also another aspect is that if you could address, and sort of the final, when they went into Iraq and, the weapons of mass destruction, all that stuff you were talking about, I've heard that even though the sanctions had been going for so long, actually by that point, by the early 2000s, the Iraqi people were able to sort of get around the sanctions to some extent. And these were extreme sanctions like you were talking about. I think, to give just an example of how insane it was, I think pencils were actually banned from being brought into Iraq because it had carbon or whatever for the pencils have carbon in them. And what the imperialists of the U.S. was saying was that these pencils could be used to make nuclear weapons. That shows you how insane this level of sanctions were. And it wasn't about weapons. It wasn't about preventing weapons of mass destruction. It was about devastating the country. But yeah, could you sort of give some more information on the actual U.S. invasion a little bit before then, about the question, were the sanctions actually starting to not be as effective by that point, so they decided to go in? And also, if you could talk about the Iraqi resistance, because as you were talking about with the Iraqi military, it was a very powerful military, and at a certain point, the Iraqi military and the Ba'athist government transitioned from a conventional warfare to a guerrilla warfare against the U.S. occupation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so first the sanctions. You know, the what had happened was, in the chronology of events, you had George Bush the father, and then George W. Bush the son, and then somewhere in between was Bill Clinton. See, George Bush the father, who has very, very good relationships with the Saudi monarchy, thought, you know, and he comes from an oil background. You know, the Bush family. I've been to a protest at I think it's Crawford Ranch. I think it's what it's called, near Austin. I actually went to the ranch as part of a anti-Bush protest that we had at the time in Texas, and I remember the Texas Rangers protecting the ranch. These guys, the Bush family, they used to be ranchers and made their way into the oil business. And so, Dick Cheney and George Bush father, George W. Bush, these are all oil men. And Michael Moore did a good job of drawing the connections between them and the Saudi monarchy. This was like a family friendship. They had a friendship, with the Saudis. And so the Saudis probably, I'm thinking, asked them to topple Saddam Hussein after the Iraq-Iran war. They're like, dudes, this guy's going to come after us. And if you really like this oil that we're sending you, you better take care of him. And so, Schwarzkopf, the U.S. general, in his memoirs wrote, and you can go back to his book and look this up, he wrote explicitly, Saddam Hussein is our single threat in the region. So these guys were targeting Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath from the get-go. They had plans, and when the Soviet Union was out of the way, they could execute those plans. Along with the British, they know, the old colonialists and the new imperialists together knew that their monarchies, their friends, and their precious oil was being threatened by Saddam Hussein, and so was their darling Israel. And so this guy was going to come after Israel, and he's going to come after the oil, and he's going to come after our friends in the, these reactionary regimes that we put in place. So there was no question in their mind that he had to go. They were just waiting for the balance of power to tilt in their favor, and it did with the end of the Cold War. And so if you go back to the memoirs by Schwarzkopf, he'll tell you, he wrote this, of course, to give justification for the eventual invasion and attack of Iraq, both in 1991 and in 2003. And so, yeah, the sanctions, what had happened was that the Democrats took government in the US. So, the old friend of the Saudi monarch, George Bush the father, is now no longer in power. And here comes Bill Clinton. And so what does Bill Clinton decide to do? You know what? I'm not going to spend American blood on this. I'll just impose these ridiculous sanctions where I'll make the Iraqis topple Saddam Hussein. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to come out as someone who had put American soldiers' lives at stake. I'm not sending American troops. And so he did these sanctions, which in effect had a huge human loss toll. I mean, it really hurt the people of Iraq. And that's where that other idiot, Madeleine Albright, that criminal, Madeleine Albright, who should be, now she's dead, somewhere in hell, but she should have been tried for war crimes against humanity for saying what she said. But that is their mindset. They don't care if 500,000 babies died in Iraq or were born mutilated because of uranium shells laying around and in the water reserves and so on. But that's their mindset. We'll just kill them softly is what we'll do. And we won't have to spend, the $1 trillion that eventually the U.S. spent, toppling basically Saddam Hussein. But it failed. They couldn't do it. The Iraqis, they couldn't do it for two reasons. They couldn't do it because the Ba'athists were brilliant in rationalizing resources. They would issue rations cards to Iraqi families. And if you meet Iraqi families today that lived under the sanctions, they'll tell you it was hell on earth. You know, there wasn't electricity, and rightly so, no pencils, no milk for, you know, children's milk wasn't allowed to go into Iraq. Things like that, you know. I lived through all of that. I was in the US at the time, but we would hear about what the sanctions were doing to the Iraqi people by United Nations experts that would come to universities and speak. I remember attending a talk in the UN, I can't remember his name now, but he was really famous. But he came to the University of Texas in Austin, and he would speak about these atrocities that were happening in Iraq under the sanctions. You know, people like Blix and others that would go to Iraq and come out and say, you know, what you're doing is wrong, you know. But they don't care. They don't care about any of that. So the Democrats failed in getting the Shiites to topple, or even Iraqis for that matter, to topple Saddam Hussein. So the next thing to do was to topple the Ba'ath militarily. And that's what George W. Bush came to do. So when he took power, it was a shift in policy, in American foreign policy, from, you know, killing Iraqis by sanctions to killing Iraqis by bullets and Tomahawk missiles and air bombing campaigns. But I know we're short on time, so let me just quickly go through the events of what took place. The war started on the 19th and the 20th of March 2003. It began by a barbaric air bombing campaign that, you know, devastated Baghdad and other targets around the country on the 19th of March. And then troops were actually deployed on the 20th of March. The war ended on the 1st of May. So it was fought for 1 month and a week and a few days. So a little bit over a month. During that time, there were 26 days of direct combat. The US deployed 500,000 troops. The Iraqi army had 500,000 soldiers and around 650,000 on reserve, so a little over 1 million. There were 6,000 Arab volunteers that came from Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, Sudan. I actually met some of the Arab volunteers who had lost fingers and limbs during the defense of Iraq against the US invasion in 2003. There were 36 nations that were involved against Iraq. So these nations would, some of them supplied troops, you know, small, you know, Britain had a few thousands. Poland was there, a few others, and then mainly logistics in either giving money or political cover for the war. Baghdad was actually captured on April 9th, 2003. According to Wikipedia, which I consider a pro-imperialist source, there were 200 US soldiers killed. There were probably more. And then according to Wikipedia, there were between 10,000 to 45,000 Iraqi soldiers that were killed during those 26 days of direct combat. Richard Pearl, who I mentioned earlier, in an interview on the 2nd of August, 2003, which is about, 5 months after the war in Iraq, gave an interview to Al-Sharq Al-Awsat newspaper, here an Arabic newspaper, and he said, we wanted to topple Saddam Hussein and rid him of the weapons of mass destruction. Now, as far as Americans were concerned, and this just shows you that America is not a democracy, as it claims, over 60% of Americans, although they approved military action against Iraq, 60% of them also preferred to have a diplomatic solution to the conflict. But the Bush administration wasn't going to hear any of that. 60% of Americans that were polled expected that terror attacks against the United States would actually increase if the war in Iraq took place. But in total disregard to that, George W. Bush committed his troops to Iraq. In 2013, 10 years later, Americans that were polled, 53% of them indicated that they thought that the Iraq war was a mistake, a little too late for the many Iraqis that were killed and the country that was sent back into the Stone Age. In fact, I think Bush was quoted at some point as saying, either him or Dick Cheney or someone there up in the ruling class said that we're going to send Iraq back to the Stone Age. Okay, they knew what they were doing. They knew the kind of hell they were about to unleash because it was a lopsided fight. You know, the U.S. had advanced warplanes, advanced tanks. Not every country in the world was with the United States. France and Germany opposed the war. So did New Zealand. There were massive international demonstrations around the world. In Rome alone, in Italy, there were 3 million protesters that went out into the street against the war in Iraq, but was totally disregarded by the U.S. media, by the U.S. government, by the European Union, by the European media. It didn't matter. In fact, there was one French source that cited that there were actually 36 million protests worldwide against the war. I can't think of another war that had 36 million people around the world protest against it. There were an estimated 3,000 protests that took place. I was in some of them in the United States between January and April of 2003. Completely didn't do anything to slow down the attack launched by George W. Bush and his administration against Iraq. In fact, the coalition Answer, which still exists, which still runs rallies today as we speak, and will be running a rally this 20th of March, goes completely, you know, they're indifferent to what Answer does and how many people Answer brings out. But it does nothing to stop the imperialists in Washington, or for that matter, from, you know, going ahead with their plans, which shows you the hypocrisy of Western society that claims itself to be a representative of the people and listens to the voice of the people in a democracy, which is supposed to have, you know, take into account what the people say. You know, these protests go completely unnoticed by the ruling class, basically.
Absolutely.
So yeah. So and just to finish off that point, you know, Kofi Annan, the United Nations Secretary General, comes out 1 year later. Imagine this. I mean, this is also hypocrisy. In 2004, he declared the Iraqi invasion illegal and that it goes against the United Nations Charter. So in essence, we live in a very unfair world where the imperialist power and hegemony rules, and it doesn't matter what the people think or say, because they're going to go ahead and do what they want to do regardless. And so that should expose the hypocrisy of this imperialist system that we live under.
You know, the United States, despite all the propaganda that it uses against any country that it's targeting, whether it be Iraq or North Korea or Venezuela, the United States is not a democracy. The United States government does not care about really the opinion of the American people. The only thing that they want is every 4 years, a section of the American public to come out and support this candidate or that candidate, who at the end of the day have really the same agenda, maybe a slightly different tactic, a slightly tactical difference of how to achieve that agenda. But Yeah, it's interesting these names you're mentioning, like Pearl and you know, the neocons and all these people, because they're still around today. You know, Bolton, for example, very infamous neocon who was big in advocating for the war with Iraq, um, and other people like that. You know, these people were sort of brought back in. You know, these people should have no career. They should, honestly, as you described, these people are war criminals. They should be in prison. But like Bolton, for example, he was brought back in by the Trump administration. Then he was removed from the Trump administration. Didn't really do anything to change the Trump administration's policy. It still continued this neocon agenda with or without Bolton. But it's just interesting. And you see with the Biden administration, he brought back in a lot of these people who were big advocates for the Iraq war, like Blinken as a big advocate for it, and other imperialist aggression since then. So yeah, these people haven't been held accountable. But as you rightly pointed out, these wars are not popular with the American people. I think now it's even with the Republicans, we saw like during the Trump campaign, he was criticizing because he was running against Bush, not George Bush, but Jeb Bush, his brother. And in the 2016 campaign, he was condemning the Bush administration for the war in Iraq. And he got a lot of support from that, from the Republican base, actually, because most Americans understand that they're being lied to about these wars, and that there's these endless wars which don't make the lives of American people better, certainly don't make the lives of the people in these countries being attacked better, just makes things much worse. And as we've gone over, turned Iraq into a complete failed state to where we are today. And with all the fighting that's been going on, you know, there's been the Iraqi resistance to the U.S. occupation, which we could get into. But also there's been the sectarian violence, which was deliberately, and I think I'd really be interested to hear you elaborate on this, how the U.S., in collaboration with Iran, worked to deliberately sow sectarian division and infighting and violence within the country to try and get Iraqis to kill each other, to try and create permanent or long-lasting devastation and civil war and infighting within the country to prevent Iraq from coming back. Because, you know, there's this invasion, occupation for years. It's been 20 years now. It's 20 years since the U.S. invasion. They deliberately sowed sectarian division to try and, after, you know, so long after the invasion, so that long after there could be division and infighting within the country to prevent Iraq from rising again to be such a strong power as it was under the leadership of Saddam. So yeah, could you elaborate on that, on the Iraqi resistance on one hand, but also how the U.S. and Iran worked deliberately and together to sow sectarian division in the country?
Okay, so Baghdad falls on April 9th of 2003, and almost immediate is the Iraqi resistance going into action. The reason for that is because the Ba'athist government had already pre-planned the second phase of the battle against the U.S. invasion, which was going to be underground. They were going to form resistance cells, and these resistance cells were given a great amount of money and a great amount of arms that were being kept by the Ba'athist party, so that the second phase would take place, and that is attacking the U.S. Invaders. And that's exactly what happened. Saddam Hussein, in fact, led the first operation, the resistance operation, and if we had time, I can give you some details about that. And then his deputies, Taha Yassin Ramadan and Izzat al-Duri, who became eventually the head of the Iraqi resistance after the execution of President Saddam, and became the leader of the resistance. And this took place, you know, many people have cited this as one of the fastest resistance against an invasion to take place, one of the most effective, one of the most, large in numbers, because of the preparations that were being made by the Ba'ath ahead of the invasion. And so from 2003 to 2011, for a period of 8 years, it never stopped. And the casualties reported by the Ba'athists were huge, that the Americans were sustaining somewhere around 175,000 casualties. The U.S. only admitted to 4,000, but the figures, and there's drastic difference in the figures. In any case, it was a very successful resistance, and I say that because when Obama came to power in 2011, he pulled American regular troops out of Iraq. And so this has been promised, since the time of George W. Bush. In fact, a good friend of mine, Jeff Archer, published the best book on the Iraq invasion that I can recommend. I'll write it in the chat group in case you want to show it, but it's The Mother of All Battles.
Yeah, we could include that in the description of the video for the audience. Check out in the description, you could find the book.
And I think it's under his pen name, Malcolm Lagos. They can find it, Lagos. And so I put it there in the chat. But this is the best book you can read about the Iraqi invasion. And he does a great job of explaining the reasons behind it and what took place. But one of the things that I wanted to allude to was this point about sectarianism. The American administration, as I mentioned before, under Bill Clinton, tried to incite the Shiites in the southern part of Iraq to topple the Ba'athist government. So this has been one of the strategies that they used to prevent them from committing American soldiers on the battleground. When that failed and the Ba'athists were successful at crushing that, and keep in mind that there is a segment of the Iraqis that are allied to Iran historically. The Dawah Party, which has in its members Noor al-Maliki, Haidar Abadi, the current prime minister, his father was executed, I believe, Shayya is his last name. He was executed by the Ba'athists for being a member of the Dawah Party. He currently runs Iraq as prime minister. All of these Dawah Party members pledged their allegiance to the Iranian Revolution. They were active members in a political organization that worked for many years to sabotage the Ba'athist government rule. And in fact, Noor al-Maliki himself was implicated in the bombing of the Iraqi embassy in Beirut, which killed a very famous poet's wife that we know as Balqis al-Rawi. She was one of the casualties, one of the martyrs that died in that embassy bombing in Beirut. And so these aren't by any means passive activists. These were actively involved in planting bombs and planning coups and working actively within Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath rule. And so these are the same clowns that the Americans brought back into power and that are currently, stealing and running the country into ruins through the successive governments that took office after the 2011 pullout of U.S. troops. In fact, Lloyd Austin, who is the current U.S. Secretary of Defense, just made a visit to Iraq to pledge his allegiance to the pro-Iran government that is in Baghdad. This government has been under protest by the Iraqis since 2019 for its corruption and for stealing the money of the country and running it into ruins. After 20 years of the invasion of Iraq, what we have today is a devastated country that lacks the basic needs to provide its citizens. We're talking about basic needs such as clean water, electricity, um, you know, schools, hospitals, universities. The country has been run into ruins by these gangs of pro-Iran politicians that have enriched themselves at the expense of the people in the country. And so this idea that the United States is hostile to Iran, not always. When it comes to Iraq, they're partners. So why would Lloyd Austin go and meet Shaya, the current prime minister, and before him, Nour al-Maliki, Haidar al-Abbadi, all these Dawah party members that pledged their allegiance to Khomeini and Khamenei and the current Iranian regime, if the United States was truly opposed to Iran. In fact, when the U.S. pulled its troops in 2011, they handed Iraq to Iran to run. And that's what it has done. It has run it to the ground since 2003, in fact. And when Paul Bremer became the military governor of Iraq, one of the first things he did was dissolve the Iraqi army, ban the Ba'ath, implement a de-Baathification. If the Ba'ath wasn't such a threat to the U.S. imperialists, why would they go out of their way to instill a de-Baathification law? If the Iraqi people were so opposed to the Ba'ath and can't wait to get rid of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath, well, why would you need to do any of that? Why don't you
That's
just
right. And to
let them abandon the Ba'ath on their own?
That's right. And to just briefly, just to put an emphasis on that. So the U.S. with the de-Baathification banned the Ba'ath Party, outlawed like Baathism, like nowadays. My understanding is if you have like a book by Saddam Hussein, even or some Ba'athist literature, you could be in serious trouble for that. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the Baathists today in Iraq are in jail. They're chased out of their jobs. They can't maintain employment. They are dying in their prison cells because of medical neglect. Yeah, you can't just walk around and say you're a Baptist in Iraq. There's a
So what the U.S.
law that
did,
bans the Ba'ath in Iraq.
right? They banned it. So what the U.S. did was they banned Baathism, and they allowed for Khomeiniism, pro-Iran, all this pro-Iran stuff to be allowed in Iraq. So that should tell to all these people who think that Khomeini and Iran is such a threat to U.S. imperialism, and that Iraq is somehow like working with the U.S. against Khomeini, which is a ridiculous idea. It was the exact opposite. Khomeini was working with Israel and the U.S. against socialist Iraq. Um, it should tell you everything, how much of a threat Baathism is to imperialism and Zionism, and how much they do not fear Khomeiniism. The fact that they allow that to be control the country, no problem. They have portraits of Khomeini, all this Iranian propaganda everywhere. But if you have a book by Saddam Hussein, you'll be in serious trouble. So I just wanted to emphasize that, but please continue.
Yeah, so they first tried to incite the Shias to topple the Baathists during the sanctions, and then when they eventually took power, when the Americans invaded Iraq, they instilled in the government pro-Iran politicians, and then those pro-Iran politicians in turn created militias that right now run Iraq, and they impose their will in the streets, and they have control of the lives of the Iraqi people. And the Iraqi people resent that. They're against that. In fact, many of the chants in the mass demonstrations that took place in 2019 called for kicking Iran out of Iraq and ending the rule of pro-Iran militia in Iraqi streets. So it's an unholy marriage between the United States and Iran. Yes, they hate each other. I'm not going to say they don't. But when it comes to Iraq, it's a marriage of convenience. They do cross roads, and they do meet their interests in Iraq. And they, in effect, have handed Iraq to Iran to rule. And that just shows the hypocrisy of the American position against Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that last point is very important for people to understand because so we gave, I think, a pretty comprehensive history of the lead up to the US invasion of Iraq, how the US invasion was sort of just a continuation of US aggression against Iraq, US policy to try and destabilize and destroy the country, which had been going back since the Ba'ath Party came to power in the 1960s. It was a consistent U.S. policy through various means and various tactics. The 2003 invasion was just sort of like the most extreme form of it when all the previous attempts had failed. But I think that last point about the collaboration between the U.S. and Iran is key, and key in understanding the situation of what Iraq is going through today. And as you mentioned, the protests in Iraq, we did a very good discussion back in October about the protests going on because there's the 2019 protests, which were massive, but also last year in 2022, there was a significant upsurge in the protests, Iraqi protests against the corrupt pro-Iranian government and against the Iranian control over the country. So I urge people to check that out. People could see that. I'll include that in the description of this video. People should check that out. And I think we'll have. I think we should. It's time actually. Soon we should have another discussion because I think a lot has happened since October as far as the protests in Iraq, and we need to do an update on that. But no, yeah, the sectarianism, I think that was a key thing. And how you describe these Iranian proxies, I think, this mistake that people have about how, oh, the US and Iran are complete enemies and they never work together. Well, in Iraq, they work together directly. And I think the most blatant and vicious example of that, there are so many different pro-Iranian proxies that the US worked with, but I think probably the most egregious and criminal example was, people might remember the term death squads in Iraq. Well, the death squads in Iraq were these pro-Iranian Khomeiniist organizations, such as the Badr organization. Now, the Badr organization was a terrorist group that these are Iraqi traitors, basically, who fought on the side of Iran against their own country in the Iran-Iraq war. That shows you how loyal they are to Iran. And then with the US invasion, this group was still around. It was like an underground terrorist group, but with the US invasion, they were able to come to the surface, and the US utilized them as death squads to terrorize the Iraqi public and sow sectarian division, massacring Sunnis and others who just don't meet their extremist vision. The US worked with them to kill any opponents of the US occupation and just Iraqi civilians and such. So that was a perfect example of the US working with the most outright Iranian proxies to commit horrendous war crimes against the Iraqi people. So I think it's very clear that, because there's this mistaken idea. Sometimes people think, well, the Iraq war, it was a mistake. And people who say that it's good, they understand that it was wrong, but it was more than a mistake. It wasn't just it was deliberate. It was calculated. It was a deliberate, conscious thing, all these actions that were taken to cause as much division and destruction of the country because they wanted to destroy the country and prevent it from coming back and from rising. But as we're seeing with the protests, the Iraqi people are fighting back. They fought back in the resistance, and they're continuing to fight back now with the protests. And the Iranian hold, the US hold over the country is not as firm as the imperialists and the Tehran had hoped. And I'd like to have you back on soon to discuss the ongoing protests, because yeah, that's another thing we'll need to set a whole time to discuss what's been going on, because a lot has happened since October. You have a book, right? Can you give, and I'll put the link in the description of the video. Could you give the title of the book? And
this is the book by Jeff Archer, who is a good friend of mine, and he's also part of one of the few people that has written about Iraq. And I think the audience would find this an excellent reference. I think it talks about the invasion of Iraq and has some very valuable information. I definitely would say this is the best book that I've read on the Iraqi invasion. And so I highly recommend it for those of you that want to read more about what took place there.
Oh, but I'll definitely have that in the description. But I mean, your book, you yourself wrote a
Oh,
book on
sorry.
Iraq.
Yeah. I spoke about this last time. I have a book on the Iraqi resistance called The U.S. Foreign Policy in Iraq, and it's also available on Amazon. I'll send you a link if you like, but definitely check it out if you're interested in knowing. And what it was, I believe it was back, I forget now, but 2017. And so during that time period, there was a active armed revolt that took Al-Anbar as its center, and it lasted from 2014 to 2017. I also included in the book the work of neocons, like those war criminals, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl, all these Zionists in the U.S. administration that rallied for war against Iraq and exposed their agenda for the destruction of Iraq and the targeting of Iraq. And if I may say that the three reasons why Iraq was invaded was because it was a successful socialist model state for the Arabs, and because of the oil interests that the Americans had. Basically, they wanted to take control of the oil in the region. And the third reason is to protect both Israel and the Arab reactionary regimes in the region. Those were the three main reasons for the invasion of Iraq. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There is no link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. And Iraq did not pose a threat on the United States through terror attacks. It was not behind September 11, 2001. Twin Tower attacks. And all of those were lies and fabrications that people like the war criminal Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and Bolton and Rumsfeld and all of those other jokers tried to sell. Unfortunately, and the American people believed them, and many, I believe, still believe them for the lies that they told against Iraq.
Yeah, although I think by now, I think honestly, it's very few people who are still have that mindset, because we saw even a lot of Republicans with the Trump administration supported Trump, even though, of course, it was just rhetoric, and he did the exact opposite. He was just as much a neocon as any other president. During the campaign, he did get a lot of support from Republicans for criticizing the Bushes and the Iraq War, but absolutely. And so check out those books. The links will be in the description of this video. Thank you so much again, Falastini Moghtareb, for coming on. And yeah, to the audience, stay tuned. We're going to have more information coming forward on and updates on the situation in Iraq. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Flame of Liberation. Keep up the good work. And for all of you listening, spread the word out. Tell the truth about what happened in Iraq. And Iraq will be free one day. We believe, I believe, that it will be free one day. And I hope, and my wish is for the Ba'ath to regain power in Iraq. The sooner the better. And I'm not alone, by the way. Many Iraqis would wish that Saddam Hussein would come back and take control of Iraq, and that the Ba'ath Party would come back and take
Absolutely.
control of Iraq. So I send my love to Iraq and the Iraqi people, and I hope that they will gain victory very soon.
Absolutely. And I just one thing for people to have perspective on the situation of Iraq is, you know, despite how dark the situation is now, despite the divisions, if you look back at the time period before the Arab Socialist Party came to power, it was a very dark period. There were a lot of divisions, but nonetheless, Iraq overcame those difficulties. And at a time period before the socialist period with the Arab Socialist Party, it must have looked very dark. The way forward must have been very unclear, but nonetheless, Iraq came out of that, and I think it will again. So stay tuned for further updates, and thank you all for joining us.